In the small, quiet town of Seabrook, where the ocean kissed the cliffs and the air smelled salty and fresh, there lived a man named Charles Whitmore. To most people in town, Charles was the epitome of success, a self-made millionaire who had built his empire from scratch. He owned sprawling estates, threw lavish parties, and donated generously to charities. People admired him, envied him even, but no one truly knew the darkness that lurked beneath his polished exterior. Charles wasn't just rich, he was powerful. His name carried weight in every corner of Seabrook, but what many didn't know was that Charles had an adopted daughter. Her name was Amara, a bright and kind-hearted 16-year-old girl who had been born with cerebral palsy. Amara used a wheelchair to get around, but her spirit soared higher than anyone could imagine. She loved books about marine life and dreamed of exploring the mysteries of the deep blue sea someday. Despite her condition, she radiated warmth and hope, qualities that made her stand out in any crowd. Amara's story began tragically. Her biological parents had passed away when she was very young, leaving her orphaned. Charles, feeling a mix of guilt and obligation, decided to adopt her. At first glance, it seemed like a noble act, a wealthy man taking in a vulnerable child. But behind closed doors, things were far from perfect. Over time, Charles grew resentful. He saw Amara as a burden, a constant reminder of his own failures and shortcomings. The more he tried to maintain his image as a successful and generous man, the angrier he became toward her. For Amara, life at home was lonely and suffocating. Charles rarely spoke to her, unless it was to criticize or scold her. Meals were eaten in silence, and laughter was almost non-existent inside their grand estate. Yet despite everything, Amara held on to her dreams. Every day she would wheel herself down to the cliffs overlooking the ocean. There, surrounded by the sound of crashing waves and the salty breeze, she felt free. It was her sanctuary, the one place where she could escape the coldness of her reality. One person who often frequented the same cliffs was a teenage girl named Sophie. Unlike Charles, Sophie came from a modest background. She spent her days sketching the dramatic landscapes of Seabrook, capturing the beauty of the cliffs and the endless expanse of water beyond. Sophie was shy and kept mostly to herself, but she had a keen eye for detail and an uncanny ability to notice things others overlooked. Over time, Sophie started noticing something strange. Whenever Amara visited the cliffs, Charles would sometimes appear unexpectedly. At first, Sophie thought nothing of it. Perhaps he was simply checking up on his daughter. But as weeks went by, she began to sense tension between them. Their interactions were stiff, awkward, and occasionally heated. One afternoon, while hiding behind some jagged rocks to avoid being seen, Sophie witnessed a moment that chilled her to the bone. It happened quickly. Charles approached Amara, speaking in hushed tones. From where Sophie sat, she couldn't hear exactly what was said, but the tone was unmistakable. Cold, angry, and laced with venom. Amara, ever composed, tried to calm him down, her voice soft and pleading. Then, without warning, Charles grabbed the handles of Amara's wheelchair and pushed her dangerously close to the edge of the cliff. Sophie gasped, her heart pounding in her chest. For a brief second, it looked like he might actually push her over. But fate intervened. A sudden gust of wind blew through, causing Charles to stumble backward. Amara reacted instinctively, locking the brakes of her wheelchair just in time. The moment passed, and Charles quickly regained his composure, pretending nothing unusual had occurred. He wheeled Amara back toward the house, his expression unreadable. Sophie remained frozen, her mind racing. Had she really just seen what she thought she had? Was Charles capable of such cruelty? That night, Sophie lay awake, replaying the scene over and over in her mind. She couldn't shake the feeling that something sinister was brewing. The next morning, she returned to the cliffs, hoping to find answers. As she sketched absent-mindedly, she noticed Amara arriving, alone this time. Summoning her courage, Sophie approached her cautiously. "Hi," Sophie said softly, holding up her sketchbook. "I couldn't help but notice how much you love coming here. I've seen you reading those amazing books about marine biology. Amara smiled faintly, surprised by the friendly gesture. Thanks. I've always loved the ocean. It makes me feel alive. Their conversation flowed naturally after that. Sophie learned more about Amara's passions and dreams, while carefully observing her demeanor. There was sadness in Amara's eyes, a heaviness that hinted at struggles Sophie couldn't fully comprehend. Though she wanted to ask about Charles, Sophie held back, sensing it wasn't the right time. As days turned into weeks, Sophie continued visiting the cliffs, slowly building a friendship with Amara. Through their talks, she picked up on subtle clues, bruises hidden under long sleeves, the way Amara flinched whenever Charles entered the room. Sophie's suspicions grew stronger, but she still lacked concrete evidence. She knew she had to tread carefully. If she accused Charles outright without proof, no one would believe her. After all, he was a respected figure in Seabrook, and she was just a quiet teenager with a sketch pad. Despite the risks, Sophie couldn't turn a blind eye. Something deep inside told her she had to protect Amara, even if it meant putting herself in danger. Little did she know, her decision to intervene would set off a chain of events that would change both their lives forever. The days following Sophie's unsettling discovery at the cliffs were filled with tension and unease. She couldn't stop thinking about what she had witnessed. The way Charles had pushed Amara's wheelchair so close to the edge, the anger in his voice, and the sheer terror in Amara's eyes. It replayed in her mind like a loop, haunting her every waking moment. Sophie knew she couldn't ignore it, but she also understood that acting impulsively could put Amara in even greater danger. She needed to be smart, careful, and above all, patient. Sophie began visiting the cliffs more often, always keeping an eye out for both Amara and Charles. She didn't want to seem suspicious, so she carried her sketchbook everywhere, pretending to focus on her drawings while secretly observing their interactions. Over time, she noticed patterns. Charles would show up unexpectedly, his demeanor, calm at first but gradually shifting into something darker. His words, though muffled by distance, carried a sharpness that made Sophie's stomach churn. Amara, on the other hand, remained composed, masking her fear with quiet resilience. But Sophie could see the cracks beneath the surface. The way Amara's hands gripped the arms of her wheelchair, the slight tremble in her voice when she spoke. It was clear she was walking a tightrope, trying desperately not to provoke him. One afternoon, as Sophie sketched near the cliffs, she overheard fragments of another heated exchange between Charles and Amara. This time, Charles's tone was louder, angrier. He accused Amara of being ungrateful, of ruining his life, of being a burden he never asked for. Sophie felt her heart race as she listened, her pencil trembling against the paper. Amara responded softly, her words barely audible, but Sophie could tell she was trying to defuse the situation. For a moment it seemed to work. Charles took a step back, his expression unreadable. But then, without warning, he grabbed the handles of her wheelchair again, jerking it forward violently. Amara let out a small cry, gripping the sides of her chair tightly. Sophie's breath caught in her throat. Her instincts screamed at her to intervene, to run over and stop him, but she forced herself to stay hidden. She reminded herself that charging in blindly wouldn't help Amara. It might only make things worse. Instead, she watched helplessly as Charles muttered something under his breath and stormed off, leaving Amara alone on the cliffside. When he was finally out of sight, Sophie emerged from her hiding spot and approached her friend. "Are you okay?" Sophie asked gently, kneeling beside Amara's wheelchair. Amara nodded, though her hands were still shaking. "I'm fine," she said quietly, forcing a smile. "It's nothing I'm not used to." Sophie hesitated, unsure how to respond. She wanted to press further, to ask Amara about Charles's behavior, but she didn't want to push too hard too soon. Instead, she changed the subject, steering the conversation towards safer topics: books, dreams, and the beauty of the ocean stretching out before them. As they talked, Sophie noticed how Amara lit up when discussing her aspirations. She dreamed of becoming a marine biologist one day, exploring coral reefs and studying sea creatures. Her passion was infectious, a stark contrast to the pain she carried silently within her. Over the next few weeks, Sophie continued to visit Amara regularly. Their friendship deepened, built on shared moments of laughter and quiet understanding. Sophie found herself looking forward to these visits, not just because she cared for Amara, but because they gave her a sense of purpose. She was determined to protect her new friend no matter what it took, but Sophie's growing attachment to Amara came with its own set of challenges. The more time she spent with her, the harder it became to ignore the signs of abuse. One day, while helping Amara adjust her scarf, Sophie noticed faint bruises along her wrists. They were fresh, unmistakable. Her stomach tightened as she realized the extent of Charles's cruelty. Amara quickly pulled her sleeves down, avoiding Sophie's gaze, but the damage was done. Sophie's resolve hardened. She couldn't stand idly by any longer. That evening, Sophie sat alone in her room, staring at the sketches she had drawn of Amara and the cliffs. Each stroke of her pencil seemed to echo the weight of the secret she carried. She knew she had to confront Amara directly, to tell her what she had seen and offer her support. But how? What if Amara denied it? What if she refused to believe Sophie? The thought terrified her, but she knew she had no choice. If she didn't act, who would? The next morning, Sophie returned to the cliffs, her heart pounding with anticipation. When she spotted Amara sitting by the edge, gazing out at the horizon, she took a deep breath and approached her cautiously. "Can we talk?" she asked, her voice steady despite the storm of emotion swirling inside her. Amara looked up, surprised by the seriousness in Sophie's tone. "Of course," she replied, patting the ground beside her. "What's wrong?" Sophie hesitated, searching for the right words. Finally, she blurted out, "I saw what happened last week. With your dad. On the cliff." For a moment, Amara froze, her face pale. Then, slowly, she lowered her head, her shoulders sagging under the weight of unspoken truths. "You weren't supposed to see that," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I know," Sophie said gently, placing a hand on Amara's arm. "And I'm sorry if this is hard to hear. But I need you to know that you're not alone. Whatever you're going through, I'm here for you. We can figure this out together." Tears welled up in Amara's eyes as she struggled to hold back emotions she had buried for so long. "He hates me," she admitted, her voice breaking. "He's never wanted me. Not really. I've tried to be good, to make him proud, but it's never enough." Sophie listened intently, her heart aching for her friend. She wanted to promise that everything would be okay, but she knew empty reassurances wouldn't help. Instead, she focused on practical steps they could take. "We need proof," Sophie said firmly. "Something concrete that shows what he's doing. Once we have that, we can go to the authorities. He won't get away with this, I swear." Amara nodded reluctantly, though fear lingered in her eyes. Together, they began devising a plan. Sophie suggested recording conversations using her phone, capturing Charles's abusive words and actions on tape. It was risky, but they both knew it was their best chance at exposing the truth. From that day forward, Sophie vowed to stay by Amara's side, protecting her and helping her gather the evidence they needed. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting golden hues across the cliffs, Sophie and Amara sat in silence, each lost in their thoughts. The road ahead would be difficult, fraught with uncertainty and danger. But for the first time in a long while, Amara felt a flicker of hope. She wasn't alone anymore, and with Sophie by her side, she believed they could face whatever lay ahead together. The days following their heart-to-heart conversation were a mix of determination and quiet anxiety for Sophie and Amara. They had made a pact to gather evidence against Charles and expose the truth, but the weight of their plan hung heavy over them. Every step they took felt like walking on thin ice, each move calculated yet terrifyingly uncertain. For Amara, the stakes were unimaginably high. If Charles ever suspected what they were doing, there was no telling how far he might go to silence her. Or Sophie. Sophie's phone became their most important tool. It was small, discreet, and easy to hide, making it perfect for recording conversations, without drawing suspicion. But using it required precision and timing, things that weren't always easy when living under the same roof as someone as unpredictable as Charles. Amara knew better than anyone how quickly his mood could shift from calm indifference to explosive rage. She had spent years learning to read the subtle signs, the twitch of his jaw, the narrowing of his eyes, the way his voice would drop an octave before launching into one of his tirades. Now, those instincts were more crucial than ever. Their strategy was simple but risky. Whenever Charles sought Amara out for one of his talks, she would subtly position her phone nearby, ensuring it captured every word. Sophie coached her on how to keep the device hidden, under cushions, inside books, or even tucked into the folds of her wheelchair. At first, Amara struggled with the fear of being caught. Her hands trembled as she set up the recordings, and her heart raced every time Charles entered the room. But with Sophie's encouragement, she grew bolder, finding strength in the knowledge that someone finally believed her. One evening, Charles summoned Amara to the library, a grand room filled with towering bookshelves and dim lighting. The air was thick with tension as he paced back and forth, his polished shoes clicking against the hardwood floor. Amara sat quietly in her wheelchair, clutching the arms tightly while trying to appear calm. Unbeknownst to him, her phone lay hidden beneath a stack of papers on the desk beside her, its microphone picking up every sound. "You think I don't see what you're doing?" Charles began, his voice low and menacing. "You think I don't know you've been sneaking around behind my back?" Amara swallowed hard, her throat dry. "I don't know what you mean," she replied softly, keeping her tone neutral. "Don't play dumb with me," he snapped, slamming his fist onto the desk. The sudden noise made Amara flinch, but she forced herself to stay still. "I've seen the way you look at me, the way you talk to people. You're planning something, aren't you, trying to turn everyone against me?" Amara shook her head, tears welling up in her eyes. "No, I swear, I'm not. Enough." Charles cut her off, his face flushed with anger. "You ungrateful little brat. After everything I've done for you, this is how you repay me? By plotting to ruin my reputation?" As his words spilled out, venomous and cutting, Amara closed her eyes, focusing on the faint hum of the phone recording everything. She reminded herself why she was enduring this, to break free from his control once and for all. When Charles finally stormed out of the room, slamming the door behind him, Amara exhaled deeply, her body trembling with relief and exhaustion. Later that night, Sophie met Amara in secret, retrieving the phone to review the recording. As they listened to Charles's rant together, Sophie felt a surge of both anger and sadness. His words were cruel, dehumanizing, and utterly devoid of compassion. But they also served as undeniable proof of his abuse, a weapon they could use to bring him down. Despite their progress, the pressure mounted with each passing day. Charles grew increasingly suspicious, his sharp eyes scrutinizing Amara's every move. He began questioning her about her whereabouts, demanding to know who she had been talking to and why she seemed so distant lately. Amara did her best to deflect his inquiries, brushing them off with vague answers and feigned indifference. But Charles wasn't easily fooled. One afternoon, he cornered her in the hallway, his expression cold and calculating. "Where's your phone?" he demanded, holding out his hand expectantly. Amara froze, panic rising in her chest. She hadn't anticipated this moment, the possibility that he might ask for her phone outright. Thinking quickly, she forced a smile. "It's charging in my room," she lied, hoping he wouldn't press further. Charles studied her for a long moment, his gaze piercing. Then, without another word, he turned and walked away. Amara let out a shaky breath, her knees nearly buckling beneath her. She knew she couldn't keep dodging him forever. Sooner or later he would discover the truth, and when he did, there was no telling what he might do. That evening, Sophie arrived at the estate under the cover of darkness, slipping through the shadows to meet Amara near the cliffs. They needed a backup plan, a fail-safe in case Charles found out about the recordings. Together, they decided to create duplicates of the files, storing them in multiple locations. Sophie uploaded copies to a secure cloud account and saved others on a USB drive, which she hid in a hollowed-out rock near the cliffs. If anything happened to either of them, the evidence would still be safe. But their preparations came at a cost. The constant fear of discovery weighed heavily on both girls, leaving them physically and emotionally drained. Amara barely slept, haunted by nightmares of Charles discovering the truth. Sophie, too, struggled to focus during the day, her mind consumed with worry. Yet, despite the toll it took on them, neither of them wavered. They clung to the hope that their efforts would pay off, that justice would prevail in the end. One fateful morning, disaster struck. Charles approached Amara during breakfast, his demeanor eerily calm. "We need to have a chat," he said, gesturing for her to follow him. Amara obeyed silently, dread pooling in her stomach. Once they were alone in his study, Charles locked the door behind them and turned to face her, his expression unreadable. "I've noticed something odd recently," he began, his voice dangerously soft. "You've been acting different, distant, and now I've discovered something interesting." He held up her phone, waving it tauntingly in front of her. "Care to explain?" Amara's heart sank. She had forgotten to retrieve the device after their last recording session, leaving it vulnerable to discovery. Desperate to salvage the situation, she tried to play innocent. "I don't know what you're talking about," she stammered, her voice shaking. Charles smirked, scrolling through the phone until he found the audio files. His smile faded, replaced by a look of pure fury. "So, you thought you could betray me, huh?" he spat, advancing toward her. "You think you can take me down with these little recordings?" Amara backed away instinctively, her wheelchair bumping against the edge of the desk. "Please, I didn't save it," Charles roared, grabbing her roughly by the arm. "You'll regret crossing me, girl. Mark my words." In that moment, Amara realized the full extent of the danger she was in. Charles wasn't just angry. He was livid, consumed by a rage that left no room for reason. Without hesitation, he confiscated her phone and locked her in her room, cutting her off from Sophie and any chance of escape. Trapped and terrified, Amara feared the worst, that Charles would carry out his threats now that he knew she posed a threat. Meanwhile, Sophie waited anxiously for Amara's signal, unaware of what had transpired inside the estate. Hours passed, with no word, and unease gnawed at her gut. Something was wrong. She could feel it. Determined to help her friend, Sophie sprang into action, reaching out to trusted adults in the community and sharing fragments of the story. Though hesitant at first, several agreed to listen to the recordings and promised to intervene if necessary. As night fell over Seabrook, Sophie prepared for the biggest risk of her life. Armed with courage and a desperate need to protect Amara, she vowed to infiltrate the estate and confront Charles herself. Whatever happened next, she knew one thing for certain: they were running out of time. The night was cold and eerily quiet as Sophie prepared for what she knew would be the most dangerous mission of her life. Her heart raced with every step she took toward the estate, each shadow on the path feeling like a looming threat. She had spent hours planning this, studying the layout of the house, memorizing the blind spots in the security cameras, and rehearsing exactly what she needed to do. But no amount of preparation could calm the storm of fear swirling inside her. This wasn't just about bravery anymore. It was about saving Amara. Sophie moved cautiously, sticking close to the hedges lining the property. The mansion loomed ahead, its windows dark except for one faint light glowing in the upstairs hallway. That had to be Amara's room. Sophie clenched her fists, reminding herself why she was doing this. If Charles thought he could silence Amara forever, he was wrong. Sophie wouldn't let that happen, not while she still had breath in her body. Reaching the side door, Sophie pulled out a small toolkit she'd borrowed from her uncle's shed. It was crude, but functional, and after a few tense minutes, the lock clicked open. She slipped inside, her sneakers making almost no sound against the polished marble floors. The air inside was heavy, filled with an unsettling stillness that made her skin crawl. Every creak of the floorboards felt deafening, every shadow seemed to shift unnaturally. Sophie forced herself to focus, inching closer to the staircase that led to the upper level. As she climbed the stairs, Sophie replayed their plan in her mind. They had agreed that Amara would leave her phone charging near the window as a signal if anything went wrong. When Sophie saw the faint glow of the charger cord through the glass earlier, she knew Amara was in trouble. Now her only goal was to get to her friend and get them both out safely. But when Sophie reached the top of the stairs, she froze. The hallway stretched before her, dimly lit by a single overhead light. At the far end, she could see a figure pacing back and forth. It was Charles. His silhouette was unmistakable, his movements sharp and agitated. Sophie pressed herself against the wall, holding her breath as he muttered to himself, his voice low and venomous. She couldn't make out the words, but the tone sent chills down her spine. Whatever he was thinking, it wasn't good. Sophie waited, counting the seconds until Charles turned and disappeared into another room. As soon as the coast was clear, she darted down the hall, her eyes fixed on the closed door at the very end. That was Amara's room. She reached it quickly, her hands trembling as she twisted the doorknob. Locked. For a moment, panic threatened to overwhelm her. Then she remembered the bobby pin tucked into her pocket, a trick she'd learned from watching old detective shows. With shaking fingers, she worked the pin into the lock, sweat dripping down her temples. After what felt like an eternity, the mechanism clicked and the door swung open. Inside, Amara sat on the edge of her bed, her face pale and streaked with tears. Her wheelchair was parked nearby, untouched. When she saw Sophie, her eyes widened in shock. "What are you doing here?" she whispered hoarsely. "He'll kill you if he finds you." "We don't have time for this," Sophie said urgently, grabbing Amara's hand. "We need to go, right now." Amara hesitated, glancing toward Imo, the door. "He took my phone. He knows everything. What if he comes back?" "He won't catch us," Sophie promised, though her voice wavered slightly. "I've got a plan. Just trust me." Helping Amara into her wheelchair, Sophie guided her quietly toward the door. They moved as fast as they dared, staying close to the walls to avoid detection. But just as they reached the staircase, a loud voice echoed through the hall. "Where do you think you're going?" It was Charles. He stood at the opposite end of the corridor, his face twisted with fury. In his hand, he held a flashlight, its beam cutting through the darkness and landing directly on them. Sophie's stomach dropped. There was no escape now. "Stay where you are," Charles barked, advancing toward them. "You think you can run? You think you can ruin me and walk away?" Sophie stepped protectively in front of Amara, her mind racing. She had to buy them some time, anything to keep Charles distracted long enough for someone to notice something was wrong. Earlier, she had contacted a local teacher who trusted her, leaving a cryptic message asking for help. If they were lucky, someone might already be on their way. "You're not going to hurt her anymore," Sophie said firmly, her voice steadier than she expected. "People know what you've done. It's over." Charles laughed bitterly, the sound echoing off the walls. "People? Who would believe two pathetic girls over me? I own this town. No one will listen to you." His words stung, but Sophie refused to back down. "Maybe not everyone," she shot back, "but enough people will. And when they hear those recordings, they'll know exactly who you really are." For a moment, Charles faltered, his expression flickering with doubt. Then, with a snarl, he lunged forward, reaching for Sophie. Acting purely on instinct, Sophie dodged sideways, shoving a nearby side table into his path. The wooden legs caught him mid-stride, sending him stumbling backward. He crashed into the railing of the staircase, his arms flailing wildly as he fought to regain his balance. And then, with a sickening crack, the railing gave way. Time seemed to slow as Charles teetered on the edge, his eyes wide with terror. For a split second, he locked gazes with Sophie, and she saw something in him she hadn't expected. Fear. Real, raw fear. Then, with a final cry, he toppled over the side, disappearing into the darkness below. The silence that followed was deafening. Sophie and Amara stared at the broken railing, their hearts pounding in unison. Neither of them spoke. Neither of them dared to move. Finally, Sophie turned to Amara, her voice barely above a whisper. "Are you okay?" Amara nodded slowly, though her face was ghostly white. "Is he—" "I don't know," Sophie admitted, swallowing hard. "But we need to get out of here now." They hurried downstairs, avoiding the gaping hole where the railing used to be. Outside, the cool night air hit them like a wave, grounding them in reality. Sophie wheeled Amara toward the cliffs, knowing they needed to put as much distance between themselves and the estate as possible. Behind them, the faint wail of sirens began to rise in the distance. The authorities were finally on their way. When they reached the cliffs, Sophie collapsed onto the ground beside Amara, her legs giving out beneath her. For a long moment they simply sat there, staring out at the endless expanse of water stretching before them. The weight of what had just happened hung heavily in the air, but amidst the chaos, there was also a sense of relief. They had survived. Against all odds, they had made it through. As the first rays of dawn broke over the horizon, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold, Sophie reached out and took Amara's hand. "It's over," she said softly. "Whatever happens next, we'll face it together." Amara squeezed her hand tightly, tears streaming down her face. For the first time in years, she allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, she was finally free. The first rays of sunlight crept over the horizon, casting a soft glow across the cliffs where Sophie and Amara sat side by side. The night had been long and harrowing, filled with fear, adrenaline, and moments that felt like they were ripped straight from a nightmare. But as dawn broke, bringing with it the promise of a new day, the two girls allowed themselves a brief moment of quiet reflection. Their hands were still clasped tightly together, a silent reassurance that they weren't alone in this. But their peace was short-lived. The distant wail of sirens grew louder, cutting through the tranquility of the morning. Sophie glanced over her shoulder, spotting flashing red and blue lights weaving through the narrow roads leading to the estate. Help was arriving, but so was scrutiny. What had happened inside that house would soon become public knowledge, and both girls knew they couldn't avoid answering questions about it. Sophie stood up slowly, brushing dirt off her jeans. "We should go meet them," she said, her voice steady despite the exhaustion etched on her face. "They'll want to talk to us." Amara nodded hesitantly, gripping the arms of her wheelchair nervously. "What do we say?" she asked, her voice trembling. "About everything?" "The truth," Sophie replied firmly. "Just tell them what you've lived through. You don't have to protect him anymore." Amara looked down at her lap, tears welling up in her eyes. She wanted to believe Sophie, but years of living under Charles's control had taught her to be cautious. Speaking out meant exposing not only his cruelty, but also the secrets she had buried deep within herself. Secrets she wasn't sure she was ready to share with anyone, let alone strangers. As the police cars screeched to a halt near the estate, officers spilled out, their expressions grim. A paramedic team followed closely behind, carrying stretchers and medical kits. Word had spread quickly about the accident, or whatever it was, at the Whitmore mansion, and the entire town seemed to hold its breath, waiting for answers. Sophie pushed Amara's wheelchair toward the commotion, her heart pounding with every step. When they reached the scene, an officer approached them immediately. He introduced himself as Detective Harris, his tone calm but authoritative. "Can you tell me what happened here?" he asked, his gaze shifting between Sophie and Amara. Sophie took a deep breath, steadying herself before speaking. "We need to show you something," she said, pulling out her phone. Earlier, she had retrieved the duplicate recordings from the hidden USB drive near the cliffs. Now she handed the device to the detective, explaining how Charles had abused Amara for years, culminating in the confrontation that ended with his fall. Detective Harris listened intently, his expression unreadable as he reviewed the audio files. Other officers began combing through the estate, searching for physical evidence to corroborate their claims. Meanwhile, paramedics confirmed that Charles had indeed fallen from the upper level of the house, landing on the marble floor below. Though critically injured, he was still alive. Barely. For Amara, hearing that Charles had survived brought mixed emotions. On one hand, she felt a pang of guilt, wondering if she should feel remorse for what had happened. On the other hand, she couldn't deny the sense of relief that washed over her, knowing she no longer had to live in constant fear of him. Sophie stayed close, offering quiet reassurance whenever Amara faltered or hesitated during questioning. As the investigation unfolded, the truth came pouring out. Neighbors who had once admired Charles began sharing stories they had ignored or dismissed, whispers of his temper, rumors of neglect, and glimpses of Amara's bruises that everyone chose to overlook. The recordings sealed the case, leaving no room for doubt about Charles's abusive behavior. The community, shocked and ashamed, rallied around Amara, vowing to support her however they could. In the days that followed, life in Seabrook changed dramatically. Reporters descended on the small coastal town, eager to uncover every detail of the scandal. Sophie found herself thrust into the spotlight, hailed as a hero for standing up to Charles and protecting Amara. While some people praised her bravery, others questioned whether she had gone too far. Did she intend for Charles to fall? Was justice served, or was it revenge? Sophie wrestled with these questions privately, though she never doubted her actions. To her, it wasn't about punishing Charles. It was about saving Amara. Everything else was secondary. For Amara, the aftermath was equally overwhelming. Social workers and counselors worked tirelessly to ensure she had a safe place to stay while legal proceedings against Charles moved forward. Temporary guardianship was granted to a kind couple who ran a local foster home, and for the first time in years, Amara experienced what it meant to feel truly cared for. They encouraged her to pursue her dreams, enrolling her in online courses related to marine biology and helping her adapt her wheelchair for easier mobility. Despite the progress, healing wasn't easy. Nightmares plagued Amara, replaying the horrors she endured at Charles's hands. Guilt gnawed at her, even though everyone assured her she wasn't to blame. Sophie became her anchor during this time, visiting her daily and reminding her that she deserved happiness and freedom. Together, they navigated the emotional roller coaster of recovery, leaning on each other when the weight of everything threatened to crush them. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Sophie wheeled Amara back to the cliffs, the same spot where their journey had begun. It felt fitting somehow to return to the place that symbolized both their pain and their triumph. They sat in silence, for a while, listening to the rhythmic crash of waves against the rocks. "You know," Amara said finally, breaking the quiet, "I used to think I'd never escape him, that I'd always be trapped." Sophie turned to look at her, her eyes soft with understanding. "You're free now," she said simply, "and you'll stay that way." Amara smiled faintly, the gesture lighting up her face in a way Sophie hadn't seen before. "Because of you," she added softly. "If you hadn't believed me, I don't know where I'd be." Sophie shook her head, brushing away the compliment. "It's not just me," she said. "You fought for yourself too. Don't forget that." They stayed there until the stars began to twinkle above them, their bond stronger than ever. For the first time in a long while, Amara felt hopeful about the future. Charles might have cast a dark shadow over her life, but she was determined to step into the light. And with Sophie by her side, she knew she could face anything. The story of Amara and Sophie spread far beyond Seabrook, inspiring others to speak out against abuse and stand up for those who couldn't defend themselves. Their courage sparked conversations about accountability, resilience, and the power of friendship. And though scars remained, both girls emerged stronger, their hearts forever intertwined by the shared battle they had fought and won together. The weeks that followed the dramatic events at the Whitmore estate were a whirlwind of emotions for both Sophie and Amara. The town of Seabrook buzzed with conversations about what had happened, and while some people whispered judgmental remarks, behind closed doors many others rallied around Amara, offering support in ways she never expected. For the first time in her life, she felt seen, not as a burden or an outsider, but as someone worthy of love and care. Sophie, too, found herself navigating uncharted territory. Being labeled a hero wasn't something she'd ever imagined, and it came with its own challenges. Strangers stopped her on the street to thank her, reporters begged for interviews, and even teachers praised her bravery in class. But through all the attention, Sophie remained grounded, her focus unwaveringly fixed on one person: Amara. She knew that none of this would matter if Amara didn't heal, not just physically, but emotionally and mentally. Amara's days slowly began to take on a new rhythm. With Charles hospitalized and unable to interfere, she was placed under the temporary guardianship of a compassionate couple who ran a foster home just outside of town. They welcomed her into their family with open arms, treating her not as a charity case but as a cherished member of their household. Their home was modest but warm, filled with laughter and the comforting aroma of homemade meals. It was worlds apart from the cold, sterile mansion where she had spent most of her childhood. Every morning, Amara woke up to sunlight streaming through her window instead of the oppressive weight of fear. Her room was small but cozy, decorated, with artwork gifted by the other kids in the foster home. For the first time, she felt like she belonged somewhere. The couple encouraged her to express herself, whether through painting, writing, or simply talking about her feelings. At first, opening up was difficult. Years of suppressing her emotions had left her unsure how to articulate them. But with time, she began to trust again. Sophie visited often, sometimes bringing snacks they'd share while watching movies together, other times helping Amara practice driving her wheelchair over rough terrain near the cliffs. These visits became a lifeline for both girls. Sophie listened without judgment whenever Amara needed to vent, and Amara, in turn, reminded Sophie of the importance of self-care when the pressure of being a hero threatened to overwhelm. Her one afternoon, as they sat side by side overlooking the ocean, Sophie pulled out her sketchbook and handed it to Amara. "Here," she said with a grin. "I think it's time you tried drawing something." Amara laughed nervously. "I'm not an artist like you, I'll probably mess it up." "That's the point," Sophie replied, nudging her playfully. "It doesn't have to be perfect. Just draw whatever makes you happy." After some hesitation, Amara picked up a pencil and began sketching. At first, her lines were shaky and uncertain, but as she lost herself in the process, her confidence grew. By the end of the session, she had created a simple yet beautiful image of a dolphin leaping out of the water. Sophie clapped enthusiastically, making Amara blush with pride. "You should frame that," Sophie teased. "Seriously, it's amazing." Their shared laughter echoed across the cliffs, a sound so pure and joyful that it seemed to chase away the lingering shadows of the past. Moments like these reminded them both of how far they'd come and how much brighter the future could be. Meanwhile, legal proceedings against Charles moved forward steadily. Evidence collected from the estate, combined with the recordings Sophie and Amara had gathered, painted a damning picture of his abuse. Witnesses came forward, recounting instances where they had suspected foul play but hadn't acted. The community's collective guilt spurred them into action, organizing fundraisers and awareness campaigns to prevent similar tragedies from happening in the future. When the trial finally began, Amara was called to testify. It was one of the hardest things she'd ever done, sitting in that courtroom and reliving every painful memory. But Sophie was there beside her, holding her hand tightly throughout the ordeal. As Amara recounted her experiences, the insults, the neglect, the fear, it was impossible for anyone to deny the truth. Even those who had once doubted her story now looked at her with sympathy and respect. Charles, weakened and confined to a hospital bed, appeared via video link during the trial. His arrogance had evaporated, replaced by a frailty that mirrored the fragility of his empire. When the verdict was announced, guilty on multiple counts of abuse and endangerment, the entire courtroom erupted in applause. Justice had been served, though it couldn't erase the scars he had inflicted. Still, for Amara, the ruling marked the official end of her nightmare. With Charles sentenced to prison, Amara officially gained independence. A judge granted permanent custody to the foster family, ensuring she would have a stable and loving environment moving forward. To celebrate, the community threw a small party at the cliffs, complete with balloons, music, and plenty of food. Amara stood at the center of it all, smiling shyly as people congratulated her on her strength and resilience. That night, as the EI festivities wound down, Sophie and Amara returned to their favorite spot overlooking the ocean. The stars shimmered above them, casting a soft glow over the waves below. Neither girl spoke for a long time, content to simply exist in the moment. Finally, Amara broke the silence. "Do you think we'll ever forget all of this?" she asked softly. "Probably not," Sophie admitted. "But maybe we don't have to. Maybe it's okay to carry it with us as long as we let it remind us how strong we are." Amara nodded thoughtfully. "You're right. I don't want to forget. Not entirely. Because if I hadn't gone through all of this, I wouldn't have met you," Sophie smiled, reaching over to squeeze her hand. "And I wouldn't have met you either. So I guess it worked out in the end." As they gazed out at the endless expanse of water stretching before them, both girls felt a profound sense of peace. The road ahead wouldn't always be easy. They knew that, but they also knew they wouldn't face it alone. Together, they had weathered a storm stronger than either of them could have imagined, emerging stronger and more united than ever. In the months that followed, Amara continued pursuing her dreams of becoming a marine biologist, enrolling in online courses and volunteering at a local aquarium. Sophie, inspired by their journey, decided to study journalism, determined to give a voice to those who couldn't speak for themselves. Both girls vowed to use their experiences to help others, founding a foundation dedicated to supporting disabled youth facing neglect or abuse. Though the scars of their past would always remain, they no longer defined them. Instead, they served as reminders of the battles they had fought and won together. And as they stood on the cliffs one final time, watching the sun dip below the horizon, they knew they had triumphed, not just over Charles, but over the darkness that had once threatened to consume them.